Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC webinar, Make Your Program Work, Cultural Adaptation Resources for Latino Serving Substance Use Treatment Organizations. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Monica Ulibarri, Associate Professor at the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant International University in San Diego. I will tell you a little bit more about her soon. During today's webinar, all participants will be muted. The audio will be streamed through the computer, so please make sure that your computer speakers are turned on and off to hear today's presentation. I'm going to review a few other housekeeping items. If you notice that your viewer does not fit your screen, you can expand it by clicking the expand button located in the top right corner indicated by the red arrow. And click there. You'll see that your viewer is expanded to fit the entire screen. Also, you can collapse the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen by clicking the small red arrow located on the left of the toolbar. You can click it again, and it will expand. As I mentioned, for today's webinar, all participants will be muted. As we move to the presentation, if you have a question for our presenter, we ask that you use the chat box on the toolbar. Simply type your question and hit send. What we're going to do is that after Dr. Ulibarri finishes her presentation, we'll allow 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. And if we don't have enough time to answer all of the questions, we'll post them along with the recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint presentation. So a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides and the questions, as I mentioned, will be available at our website at www.attcnetwork.org/Hispanic and Latino approximately 1 week from today. You can also find recordings and PowerPoint slides from all of our past webinars at the same URL. Also, one NADAC, one NBCC, and one ICNRC continuing education credit is available to those who attend today's live event. If you're interested in obtaining CEUs from these organizations, you may email us at hispaniclatino@uccaribe.edu. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the network. Today's webinar is sponsored by the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC, which is part of the Addiction Technology Transfer Center Network. And today is the 32nd webinar in a series that we have been offering, and also the last one for this funding cycle. The ATTC network is funded by the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration and serves a critical role in improving the health of the U.S. The network achieves this by translating, disseminating, and promoting the adoption and implementation of evidence-based clinical practices and strives to improve the health and wellness of individuals whose lives have been impacted by substance use disorders. So if you want to learn more about the network, its products and programs, you can visit the website attcnetwork.org. As I mentioned, today's webinar, ATTC network is funded by SAMHSA. SAMHSA strives to reduce the impact of substance use and mental health issues on the U.S. communities through its programs and services, and demonstrates that behavioral health is essential to health, that prevention works, treatment is effective, and people recover from mental and substance use disorders. So again, if you want to learn more about SAMHSA, you can visit their website at www.samhsa.gov. So now, let's learn a little bit more about our presenter. Dr. Ulibarri received her BA in Psychology and Spanish from Claremont McKenna College and her Master's and PhD in Clinical Psychology from Arizona State University. She completed her predoctoral internship at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. Dr. Ulibarri received an NIMH research supplement to promote diversity in health-related research for her postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California in San Diego. She also received a postdoctoral training in the University of California in San Diego's Division of Global Public Health. Her current research focuses on HIV prevention with highly vulnerable populations, such as female sex workers, injection drug users, and high-risk couples along the Mexico-US border, with an emphasis on how gender-based violence, mental health, and substance use intersect with HIV risk behaviors. She also has 2 studies examining the commercial sexual exploitation of adolescent girls in San Diego County. Her clinical focus is on cognitive behavioral therapy, strategic solution-focused therapy, and multicultural therapy for English and Spanish-speaking individuals, couples, groups, and families. And we appreciate that she's offering the webinar today. So now, we're going to do our poll questioning so that we can get to know our audience. And our first question: do you currently serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders? Yes or no? And 83 of our participants say yes, 17% no. Are you planning to serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders in the next 6 months? Okay. 77% say yes, 4% no, 18% don't know. What is your current professional role? And we have 21% social worker case manager, 28% counselor therapist, 13% faculty research student, 10% government official policymaker, and 30% other. What type of setting do you currently work in? And we have 10% academic, 52% treatment, 3% research, 23% government, 13% other. So now we're going to ask 3 questions related to today's topic. Cultural adaptations refers to systematic changes made to an existing treatment process or protocol so that culture becomes part of it. Okay. And 83% of our participants say true, 17% say false. Next question. In cultural adaptations, it is important to maintain the integrity of the original evidence-based treatment. Yes or no? Okay, and 96% of our participants say true, 93%, and 7% say false. Our last question. Cultural adaptations always result in reduced disparities in services. True or false? So 46% of our participants say true and 54% say false. Okay. Okay. So now that we know our audience, I'm gonna pass the control to Dr. Ulibarri so that she can do her presentation.
Hello. Okay, so good morning. I hope that everyone can hear me well. I am in San Diego this morning. It's a little bit gray, and I'm happy to see the number of people that are on the webinar today. Very well attended. So I want to go ahead and start by talking about, well, first, let me acknowledge several of the people who have been working with me on a paper that is going to be released from the NHL ATTC about cultural adaptation. And this paper has been the basis for this webinar. And the team is Drs. Esther Calzada from the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Richard Cervantes from Behavioral Assessment, Inc., Dr. Daniel Santisteban from the University of Miami, and Dr. Guillermo Bernal from Carlos Avizu University. So please look for the paper that will be released by NHL ATTC on this topic, and of the same title. So the goals for our webinar today is to help, first of all, we'd like to help providers become more knowledgeable about cultural adaptation of evidence-based treatments. And you'll see the acronym EBTs throughout the presentation. That stands for evidence-based treatments, which are scientifically based and proven treatments. Some people in the field also refer to them as evidence-based programs or evidence-based practices. I'm using EBT in my presentation. I'll also describe to you several cultural adaptation models and frameworks, then highlight the benefits and the challenges of undertaking cultural adaptations, and then finally end with providing recommendations and resources. I do have a resource and reference page at the end of the slides that have all of the references and citations that I have in my presentation. So to give a little background, there are a great number of existing evidence-based treatments for substance use disorders, but few are specific to Latinos, or those that have been developed for one specific Latino group may not generalize to other Latino groups from different regions, historical backgrounds, religious backgrounds, or socioeconomic settings. So Latinos are a very heterogeneous group, and they may, so what fits for one Latino group may not be applicable or may not fit as well for another group. So one of the resources that so because of that, it may be necessary to do a cultural adaptation. I do want to point out that SAMHSA has a National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, and I've provided the link there. Some of them are for the general population, and there are a few that were developed for Latinos. So you may want to look at that link and the various different evidence-based programs that are endorsed by SAMHSA. Let me give you some information about the prevalence of substance use disorder treatment among Latinos in the U.S. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health from SAMHSA has information on substance use treatment need and service utilization among Latinos in the U.S. Now, you have the links in your resource page that's at the end of the slides, but I've also cut and pasted a little bit from this report so that you can see what the main highlights are. And also on the right side of the slide, you will see all of the information about where to find this report. But in kind of summary, what they did was they looked at data from 2003 to 2011 and assessed the treatment needs and the receipt of substance use treatment for Latinos. And they found that Latinos were more likely than non-Latinos to have needed substance use treatment in the past year. You can see that 9.9% versus 9.2%. And that Latinos who needed substance abuse treatment were less likely than non-Latinos to have actually received treatment in the past year. And that among Latinos who needed treatment but did not receive treatment, only 5.6% perceived a need for treatment. There's also a separate report that analyzes Latino subgroup differences, and I've provided the reference for that report in the list as well. So cultural adaptation may address some of these treatment gap needs of Latinos for substance abuse treatment that you can see are highlighted in the report. So given that they are less likely to receive treatment, that may be for a variety of reasons. It may be lack of accessibility, lack of insurance, a lack of programs that fit their needs, and cultural adaptation of existing evidence-based treatments is one way to address this disparity by creating more substance use treatment programs for Latinos that are applicable to their needs and to that specific population. So what is cultural adaptation? Cultural adaptation refers to systematic changes that are made to an existing evidence-based treatment or perhaps a process or a protocol so that the values, the beliefs, the assumptions, the language of the culture or of the group that you are working with become part of the treatment protocol. So that's the definition there. I wanted to point out a very good resource for getting more information about cultural adaptations, and that's this book that you can see pictured on the right of the slide by Dr. Guillermo Bernal and Melanie Dominique Rodriguez. It is very helpful in terms of giving information on what is cultural adaptations, what are some of the frameworks, and it gives examples of cultural adaptations. It's not Latino specific, but it has different examples from different ethnic groups in the US on cultural adaptations. They also have some recommendations for if you were going to conduct your own cultural adaptation. I'd also like to mention that there is a special issue in the journal Prevention Science that has come out this month, August 2017, that addresses evidence-based treatments and cultural adaptation. So there's a series of articles that you can read that gives you really up-to-date latest information about cultural adaptations. And that reference is also provided in the resources and reference slide. So cultural adaptations can be very systematic in which you are following a step-by-step process, very rigorous in terms of following scientific methods and based on scientific findings. So that can be based on scientific findings of the original evidence-based treatment you are using as your basis. It is very important to maintain the integrity of the original evidence-based treatment. And by saying that, it means that it's very important that you maintain the core components that are thought to be what makes the treatment work, because if you deviate too much from the integrity of the original evidence-based treatment, you may end up making an adaptation that isn't as effective. And so the process of conducting your cultural adaptation should be very transparent. In other words, you want to be very clear about what exactly you are changing and what it is or what it is you're adding, and be very well documented. You want to write step by step exactly what it was you changed or what you kept the same, so that there's very good documentation about what your adapted treatment is, so that someone else, if need be, could replicate your adapted treatment. There are a series of models and frameworks of cultural adaptation. And what I talk about today is by no means comprehensive. And in the paper that we're going to release, we provide a few examples, but it too is not meant to be a systematic review of all of the different models and frameworks of cultural adaptation. But the book that I mentioned has several good examples, and you can also find a lot of different examples in published peer-reviewed journal articles. If you enter in the terms models of cultural adaptation in the search, you will be able to find different examples and perhaps find the one that would work best for your organization. But just to give you a quick overview of what is the difference between a model and a framework. Models provide a design of a system to be replicated. In other words, it will have very specific steps that you are to follow in order to do a cultural adaptation. And then there are frameworks, which are not quite as rigorous, but provide a conceptual structure or more of a frame of reference for you to work within to create your adaptation. So let me show you a few examples. The first is an example of a cultural adaptation model, and it's called the Cultural Accommodation Model, or CAM. And the CAM is a 3-step process, which in the first step, you identify cultural gaps that are in the original evidence-based treatment. In other words, you're starting from existing evidence-based treatment, and you will be doing an analysis of what in that treatment is not addressed that would be particularly helpful for your target community. The second step is to identify solutions to be able to address those gaps in the relevant literature. So there may be suggestions in the current research literature about how to address the particular gaps that you have identified in treatment. And by that, and once you've done that, you then can incorporate those different solutions into an adapted model. And then the last step of that process would be to test your new intervention to make sure that it maintains validity or perhaps is even improved. You're actually shooting for and hoping for improved validity because it would be more applicable and more pertinent to your group. But at a minimum, you want it to maintain the effectiveness and the validity that the original evidence-based treatment had. And you can see the references are provided there, and I have the full reference at the last slide. The second example of a model is the Hybrid Prevention Program model by Castro Barrera and Martinez. This model works more on, it emphasizes similarities between the original evidence-based treatment and group on which it was created, and the similarities of your target group of which you are working with. So you assess the similarities between the original and your target group, and they suggest that you look at these 3 areas for similarities. Group characteristics, so who is your group? What are important characteristics about your group? How is that similar to, in any way, to the original group of the evidence-based treatment in which it was developed? It also looks at the program staff and admin administration in terms of who would be delivering the treatment group. Is it the same? Or do they have the same type of background? Do they have the same level of education and experience? And also looking at community factors between the original group and your target group. And it highlights the congruity between the two cultures. So again, emphasis being on what is similar. And if there is dissimilarities between the original group and your target group, the goal becomes to increase the congruity through 3 aspects. And that is cognitive information processing. And what cognitive information processing refers to is the understanding of the content of the intervention. And second is effective motivational characteristics. And what that refers to is the relevance of the content of the particular group that you're working with in terms of their values and their traditional practices. And lastly are environmental characteristics. And so that's understanding the fit with the local community that you're working with. So you may end up, you can make changes to the original model by adding modules to the existing evidence-based treatment. Perhaps you may need to change, or you can change the person's delivering the intervention. Perhaps the original was delivered in a community mental health setting by master's level clinicians, and you feel it would be better for your community to deliver the treatment in a church setting with more lay people, or perhaps promotoras or promotores delivering the intervention, because that would be more congruent with your targets, the method of what your population is comfortable with and whom they trust. So these are all, the authors say these are all potential ways in which you can change the fit of your adapted intervention to be better suited to your target community, with it, and the goal being that you achieve a balance between fidelity and fit. So meaning that the changes that you make to increase the fit don't compromise the fidelity to the original, the effectiveness of the original evidence-based treatments core components that are responsible for change. So that is a very good model that has a good balance between fidelity and fit. An example of a framework, cultural adaptation framework, is the Ecological Validity framework, and you can see the references there. The Ecological Validity framework is based on ecological validity theory and Bronfenbrenner's theory, ecological theory. They have 8 areas of culture that should be considered, and that being the language preference of your target group, perhaps any metaphors or cultural metaphors of which your target population communicates or uses to understand the world or their experiences. Goals, concepts, persons, content, context, and methods. So you are assessing the original EBT and how it addresses all of these 8 areas of culture for your specific target group. And you may need to change some of these areas in order to align your adapted program to your target population. And again, I would like, as we mentioned in the beginning of when you're conducting a cultural adaptation, you're always documenting what you find, the assessment you do about your target population, what you then change about the original evidence-based treatment, and hopefully you are then able to test your adapted treatment to see how effective it was. Now let me go over some of the benefits of cultural adaptations. Excuse me. So building on existing evidence-based treatments may be a practical starting point for some organizations, especially if they are operating on reduced or constrained resources or settings. This may be a sort of conducting a cultural adaptation may be a middle ground of where to start rather than having to start from the beginning with developing a whole new intervention from the ground up. It's also helpful in that you know that evidence-based treatments have been scientifically proven with other communities, and so therefore it increases your likelihood of being able to achieve those outcomes with yours with some adaptation. And one of the products of having cultural adaptation of evidence-based treatments is that it may improve service quality for your population. It also works to enhance engagement of your population in treatment by targeting their specific needs. It may improve attendance. It may improve their understanding and their use of the skills that they are taught. It may increase participation, retention, and overall satisfaction with the program. And when that occurs, it's research has shown that it's more likely to have better outcomes. Also, cultural adaptations can provide data for further evidence-based treatment development. In other words, it becomes part of the scientific process of moving the field forward and being able to develop and document culture-specific evidence-based treatments. There are some challenges. Oh, I also wanted to mention also another benefit is to reduce the disparities in treatment availability. So by increasing the number of treatments available to Latinos or to the group that you are working with, that is helping and reduce the disparities of availability for Latinos. There are some challenges to cultural adaptation. First is the cultural context may be very dynamic. And what we mean by that is that communities are ever changing, and there could be significant events or changes in the community that impact your clientele. So for example, I'm just thinking of our current, what you've seen in some regions of the United States where there have been an increase in immigration raids. That can instill more fear in the community in which you are working with, and so they might have an unintended effect of forcing them to go more underground and not reaching out to get services. So that may be something that you find out is really important to address for your community. Perhaps the first step for yours would be that you need to address safety issues and trust. There could be drug law changes that affect your community. Also, the communities may change in their composition. There's a lot of movement in and out of communities, and what once was perhaps a predominantly Latino community may start having gentrification, for example, and so you start to see the context of your community changing. So what ends up happening is that, or you may have had a program that was working well, and then these changes happen in the community that start to affect what you are doing, and you may need to conduct more adaptation to your program, but that may be changing as well, and so it may not last. Second is that cultural adaptations do require significant resources to be able to conduct. So first of all, you will have to have adequate funding to be able to conduct a cultural adaptation, and that can be to having funding to do the initial needs assessment of your group to find out what it is specifically that they need and you need to address. And it can be the funding to actually pilot test and run your adapted program. Not to mention the staff hours and the commitment that you would need to be able to conduct a cultural adaptation. The other piece is that you need an adequate level of knowledge about how to conduct research and how to conduct a cultural adaptation, focus groups, document your process, and conduct a pilot study and evaluation of your adapted program. So that's something to consider, which we'll talk about in the next slide. All other pieces that changes to the original evidence-based treatment can compromise fidelity. So it's possible that too many changes occur, or you happen to change the core components of the original so that what the adapted version of the intervention is less effective. And that is what you don't want to happen. And lastly is sustainability, and that kind of plays into all of the other challenges as well, is that in light of the changes that may be happening in the community and with your population and changes in availability of funding, it may be difficult to sustain your adapted intervention over time. So there are some practical considerations that you want to do if you are planning to, or if you're in the decision-making process of whether or not to conduct a cultural adaptation. So the first thing you want to do is determine your agency's capacity to do a cultural adaptation. And because, as I mentioned, resources and funding are really important, you need to do a good assessment about whether or not you have the funding, the adequate funding to be able to conduct the full process, whether or not you have enough money for such components as incentives you may to your clientele to participate in the testing of your adapted program. It's going to take additional staff hours and time, because if it's a new process in which you're undertaking, it may be slower than what your staff and your agency are used to. And so those are all important aspects to consider before you launch into that. So it's almost a cost-benefit analysis that you are conducting to decide on whether or not you want to embark on doing a cultural adaptation. And like I said, it might actually come out that starting from the middle of using an existing evidence-based treatment may be more cost-effective than creating your own. Also, you will need to assess whether your organization has the basic knowledge of research practices. If you do not have this, then you'll want to get help from a trained evaluator or a researcher, and that might be from one of your local universities. And lastly, you'll need to conduct a pilot study or an evaluation of your newly adapted intervention to make sure that it is effective. What if evidence-based treatments are required for my organization? So some local, state, county, or other foundations may require that evidence-based treatments be used as part of their funding strategy. So if you may be mandated as part of your organization to provide evidence-based treatments for your clientele, but you may not feel that the existing evidence-based treatment is adequately address or adequately addresses the needs of your community. So you will need to conduct an adaptation to be able to make it work better for your setting. What you want to do is start by selecting a well-known published evidence-based treatment. So that's where that list that I provided from SAMHSA on the National Registry of Evidence-Based Treatments can be helpful. The reason why I also like that is very helpful is that if you are seeking funding to be able to do a cultural adaptation, your funders will likely be more knowledgeable and familiar with very well-known scientifically based published evidence-based treatments. So you will have a very good rationale for even starting with a good evidence-based, well-known evidence-based treatment. And you may put forth in your proposal to do the cultural adaptation, you'll need to make sure to provide a good rationale for why your cultural adaptation is needed, and what is it about your target population that isn't being served by an existing evidence-based treatment. How is your population unique, and what might be specific challenges or risks or adversities that your population has that need to be addressed in the culturally adapted treatment that you will be creating. All of that makes for a stronger application for requests for funding to be able to do an evidence-based treatment. It may also be that you're receiving a mandate to do an evidence-based treatment and you want your funders to be aware of the importance of doing a cultural adaptation and exactly the resources that you will need in order to do a good job. You'll next want to build a team. And your team, as I mentioned in the previous slide, may involve community partners. Actually, it should always involve community partners that are helping you understand your community and their needs, and researchers to help you conduct the scientific process of evaluating and documenting your adaptation. And they may come from local universities or research agencies in your community. And that might look different. The way in which all of the members, how much they are involved may vary. And for example, if you are consulting with a researcher from a university, it may vary in how involved they are in all of the steps. They may come in at the design piece, they may come in more on consultation for evaluation. It depends on the needs that you have as your organization. Lastly, we have the advice of remembering to be Latino-centered. And what we mean by that is to avoid stereotyping and overgeneralizing. In other words, you know your community well, and Latinos are a heterogeneous group that vary from region to region, and what works for one may not work for another, or it may be that your group is more acculturated than other groups, and so the way in which traditional Latino values play out in your population may differ from other groups of Latinos, or even in what specific evidence-based treatments were developed to address. You'll want to identify specific stressors for your target Latino community, and that might be done by giving different instruments and measurements to examine levels of discrimination or immigration stress, for example, or acculturation that can affect different aspects of treatment engagement. And as I kind of mentioned before, you'll want to determine the prominence of specific values. So, not all groups of Latinos may engage in familismo or collectivism or machismo or marianismo to the same level as other groups. That can change as a factor of level of acculturation or socioeconomic status, region from which they come, country of origin. So in other words, you want to be very aware of who is your Latino group, what are exactly their values, beliefs, and how might you address those in your community. Here is the resources and reference slide to which I was referring. It's very, it's has a lot, it's very tiny print, but I wanted to make sure that you had information of where to go and find anything that I had referred to in this webinar. And lastly, I want to just acknowledge and thank the NHL ATT staff for all of their support in this webinar and in producing the paper that we are working on, and my writing team. And with that, I'll end and hand the controls back to Therese.
Thank you, Dr. Ulibarri. So we have time for a couple of questions. First question we have is, do organizations need to request special permission from EBT developers to adapt interventions?
Oh, that's a good question. The answer is that it depends. And what you should do is you should look at the information about the original evidence-based treatment, and it may be copyrighted, or it may have information about who to contact if you want to use it and if you are thinking of adapting it. There are others that are more in the public domain, in which case then you can take it and you can embark on a cultural adaptation. I'll also just say this: it may be useful to you to reach out to the people who developed the original evidence-based treatment and say, I'm thinking of doing a cultural adaptation of your treatment program, because they may have some really helpful insights or tips for you. They may want to collaborate, which is always very helpful, and they can have materials that maybe are not published or are not fully available that they'll share with you. So I think it's always helpful to reach out to them if you can.
Okay, thank you. The second question, are there specific ways to guarantee fidelity when adapting treatment interventions?
Yes, but in order to, well, by following, first of all, by following a particular model and the steps of an adaptation model, that's going to give you a framework that will help you to maintain fidelity of the original program. The other piece is, if you look at, I would advise looking up the original documentation or papers of the treatment that you're using and seeing what steps they took to develop it, and then you yourself following very similar steps to do the adaptation and making sure you document that along the way. Also, what you'll often find in publications of the original evidence-based treatments are what they believe are the core elements. And what you want to make sure to do to keep as much to the fidelity is not tamper with the core elements that have been identified as the reasons for change occurring. You might find that in subsequent journal articles or papers or publications on that treatment as well. Sometimes they don't have enough space or room to tell you that it's focused more on the development and the original outcomes of the treatment, and they don't go into as much about what are the core components or what they believe are the factors that are the agents of change in the program. And you'll find that in subsequent publications that are looking at mediators, for example. So I guess my overall advice would be try to not tamper with and change and maintain as much of the core elements that they believe are responsible for the effectiveness of the treatment as possible, and document, document, document.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see if we have another one. Okay, so those are all the questions for today. Again, I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenter, Dr. Monica Ulibarri. We appreciate your time and your collaboration with the center. And to our audience, just a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and PowerPoint slides will be posted and available at www.attcnetwork.org/Hispanic and Latino. So, so this concludes today's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Ulibarri, and thank you to our participants. If you're interested again in receiving other training, you can go to our website and look at our past webinars. So as you leave today's webinar, you'll be directed to complete a brief survey about your experience. Your feedback is very important to us, and we appreciate you taking the time to let us know what you thought of today's webinar. So thank you, everybody.